In a small town, somewhere in the Middle States, where the streets were made of packed earth, and the buildings stood simple and square along the main road, the days passed in much the same way they had passed for many years, and the people who lived there moved through their hours with steady, unhurried steps that followed patterns they knew well. The morning light came slowly over the flat horizon, touching first the upper windows of the two-story buildings on Main Street, and then spreading downward across the wooden storefronts and the simple painted signs that hung above the doorways, moving gradually and without any particular urgency, the way morning light had always moved across these buildings and these signs, year after year, season following season, in its own gentle time. Mr. Harrison, who owned the general store on the corner of Main Street and 2nd Avenue, woke at the same hour he had woken for the past 12 years, which was early enough to see the dim gray light just beginning to show itself beyond the window of his bedroom on the 2nd floor above the store. He lay for a moment in the quiet, listening to the sounds of the morning, which were very few, perhaps a bird somewhere in the distance, perhaps the faint creak of wood settling in the building as the temperature changed slightly with the coming of dawnand. Then he rose slowly, placing his feet on the cool wooden floor, and began the process of dressing for the day. His clothes were laid out in the same place they were always laid out, on the chair beside the wardrobe, and he put them on in the same order he always did. First his shirt, then his trousers, then his vest, each button fastened carefully and without rushing, because there was no reason to rush, and because he had found over the years that beginning the day slowly and methodically helped the rest of the day to unfold in much the same peaceful manner. When he was dressed, Mr. Harrison walked down the narrow stairs that led from his living quarters to the store below, his footsteps making soft, familiar sounds on each step, sounds he knew so well that he hardly heard them anymore, though they were there nonetheless, marking his passage from the sleeping part of the building to the working part, a journey of perhaps 30 seconds that he made every morning at approximately the same time. The store was dim and cool in the early morning, and Mr. Harrison moved through it without lighting a lamp just yet, because he knew where everything was, the counter here, the shelves there, the boxes of goods stacked along the far wall-land, because the growing daylight from the front windows was beginning to be enough to see by, a soft gray light that made everything look gentle and indistinct, as if the store were not quite fully awake yet itself. He went to the front door and unlatched it, though he did not open it yet, because it was still too early for customers. And then he returned to the counter and began to prepare the store for the day, which meant tidging things that did not really need tidying, because he had tidied them the evening before. But it was a comfortable way to begin, touching the familiar objects, up-straightening a stack of catalogs here, adjusting a display of buttons there, running his hand along the smooth wooden counter to make sure there was no dust, though there rarely was. The cash register sat at the end of the counter, heavy and solid, its brass fittings catching what little light there was and holding it softly. And Mr. Harrison opened the drawer to check that he had the correct change prepared for the day, though he knew he did because he had prepared it last night before closing. But checking was part of the routine, and the routine was what made the days feel orderly and calm. Outside, the town was beginning its own slow morning routines. Somewhere down the street, someone was sweeping a boardwalk. The sound of the broom bristles against wood, making a rhythmic whispering that carried on the still air. A door opened and closed somewhere. A wagon moved along the street at a walking pace, its wheels turning slowly, its horse plodding with the patient steadiness that horses have early in the morning when the day is just beginning and there is no hurry to anything. Mr. Harrison went to the shelves behind the counter and began to check his stock of the items people bought most regularly: thread, needles, common sizes of nails, lamp oil, sugar, flour, salt. These were the steady items, the ones that moved in predictable amounts week after week, and checking them was not particularly necessary, because he knew approximately how much he had of each. But the checking was peaceful and gave his hands something to do while his mind settled into the rhythm of the day. The flour barrel stood near the back wall, and he lifted the wooden lid to look inside. Seeing the pale surface of the flour, smooth and undisturbed, then replaced the lid carefully, making sure it seated properly to keep the flour fresh and free from any dust or insects. Beside the flour barrel stood the sugar barrel, and he checked that one too, and the barrel of dried beans, and the smaller container of coffee beans, each in its place, each containing more or less what it should contain, nothing surprising or unusual, everything as it ought to be. By this time, the light outside had grown stronger, and the interior of the store had brightened enough that individual objects were becoming clear and distinct: the labels on cans, the colors of different fabrics folded on the shelves, the grain of the wood in the floorboards. Mr. Harrison walked to the front window and looked out at Main Street, where the morning was continuing its slow arrival. Across the street, Mrs. Pemberton was opening the door of her husband's law office to sweep the front step, just as she did every morning. She swept slowly and thoroughly, bending to brush dust from the corners, then straightening to sweep the main part of the step, the broom moving back and forth in steady strokes that Mr. Harrison could see, but not hear, from inside his store. When she finished, she stood for a moment looking up and down the street, perhaps checking the weather, or simply taking a moment to observe the morning, and then she went back inside, and the street was quiet again. Mr. Harrison turned back to his store and began to arrange a small display of handkerchiefs near the front counter, thinking that perhaps someone might want to purchase one, though whether anyone did or not was not particularly important. The arranging itself was a pleasant task, folding the soft cotton squares and stacking them in a neat pile, making sure the edges aligned properly, touching the cloth with careful hands that had folded thousands of handkerchiefs over the years in just this same way. The door opened, and Mr. Morton came in, as he did every morning at about this time, to purchase his newspaper, which arrived by train each day from the nearest city, a city some 40 miles away, where a newspaper was published daily, with news from around the state and from the wider world beyond. The newspapers arrived in a bundle tied with string, and Mr. Harrison kept them on the counter, and Mr. Morton always took the top one, handing over his 3 cents and tucking the paper under his arm. "Morning," said Mr. Morton. "Good morning," said Mr. Harrison. "Looks like a fair day," said Mr. Morton, glancing toward the front window. "It does," agreed Mr. Harrison, and then Mr. Morton left, the door closing gently behind him, and the store was quiet again, and Mr. Harrison resumed his small tasks, moving from one thing to another without any particular plan, simply doing what seemed next to be done: dusting a shelf here, rearranging some spools of ribbon there, checking that the lamp chimneys were clean, making sure the jar of peppermint sticks was properly sealed. Time passed in the way it does on ordinary mornings, where one moment leads to another without anything particular marking the passage, except the gradual strengthening of the daylight and the occasional customer coming in to make a purchase, Mrs. Dalton, needing a card of pins. young Tommy Fletcher, sent by his mother to buy yeast for baking, the Reverend Price browsing the small selection of books on the shelf near the back, running his finger along the spines thoughtfully before selecting a volume of essays he had perhaps read before but wished to read again. Each transaction was unhurried and polite. Money was exchanged, purchases were wrapped in brown paper or placed in the customer's basket. Words were spoken in quiet tones about the weather, or about someone's health, or about how the gardens were doing this year, and then the customer would leave and the store would return to its peaceful stillness. With Mr. Harrison standing behind his counter or moving among his shelves, attending to the gentle demands of his business. Near mid-morning, when the sun had climbed higher and was casting its light more directly through the front windows, Mr. Harrison decided to take inventory of his stock of yard goods, the bolts of fabric that stood upright in a special cabinet with shallow shelves designed for that purpose. He went to the cabinet and began removing the bolts, one by one, checking each against his ledger to make sure he had noted correctly what he had and what might need to be ordered when the supply train came through next week. The fabrics were simple, mostly calico and muslin, some cotton in solid colors, a few bolts of wool for winter wear, though it was summer now and the wool would not likely be purchased for some months. He unrolled a corner of each bolt to check the quality and to make sure no insects had gotten into the cloth, though they had not, because he was careful about such things. But checking was the proper thing to do, and so he did it, working slowly through his stock, noting the numbers in his ledger with his pencil, the soft scratch of graphite on paper, a small, pleasant sound in the quiet store. When he finished with the fabrics, he rolled each bolt carefully and returned it to its place in the cabinet, making sure they stood straight and even. And then he closed the cabinet doors and stood for a moment looking at them, satisfied that this task was complete and that everything was in order. Outside, a wagon passed by, loaded with hay from someone's field. The hay stacked high and golden in the sunlight, and Mr. Harrison watched it pass, noting idly that the Johnsons must have finished their first cutting of the season, though it was no concern of his particularly, just something to observe and know about. A small piece of information about the life of the town that came to him through the window of his store as he stood there watching the street. The afternoon came on gradually, the way afternoons do in summer, with the heat building slowly and the light becoming strong and steady, filling the store with a warm glow that made everything look slightly golden. A few more customers came and went. Mrs. Brennan needed buttons to match a dress she was making. Mr. Talbot needed a new file for his workshop. Sarah Henderson came in to look at the ribbons, spending a long time deciding between a blue one and a green one, holding them both up to the light, considering them carefully, finally choosing the blue, though she seemed uncertain even as she made her purchase. And Mr. Harrison wrapped it carefully and handed it to her with a kind word, hoping she would be pleased with her choice when she got home. Between customers, Mr. Harrison swept the floor, pushing the broom in long, slow strokes that covered the boards systematically, gathering the small amount of dust and debris that had accumulated during the morning into a pile near the back door, which he then swept out into the alley behind the store, where the wind would eventually carry it away, or the rain would wash it into the ground, and it would become part of the earth again, as everything eventually did. He noticed that one of the front windows had some fingerprints on it, probably from a child pressing close to look at something in the display. And he got a cloth and some vinegar water and carefully cleaned the glass, working in circular motions, making sure to get the corners, the cloth squeaking slightly against the glass. The vinegar smells sharp and clean for a moment before fading into the general smell of the store, which was a combination of many things: wood and cloth and coffee and soap and paper and all the other goods that filled the shelves, blending together into a scent that was not particularly strong, but was familiar and, to Mr. Harrison, pleasant. The afternoon continued in much the same way the morning had, with time moving steadily forward at its own pace, neither fast nor slow, just present and passing, marked by the movement of sunlight across the floor, the occasional customer, the small tasks that Mr. Harrison found to do to keep his store orderly and himself occupied. He checked his stock of writing paper and envelopes. He straightened the patent medicines on their shelf, making sure the labels all faced forward. He counted the number of brooms he had in stock, which was 4, and made a note in his ordering book that he might need more before winter, when people often wanted new brooms to do their fall cleaning. At one point, he sat down on the stool behind the counter to rest for a few minutes, not because he was particularly tired, but because it was pleasant to sit sometimes and simply watch the quiet store, the way the light fell across the merchandise, the way everything sat in its designated place, orderly and peaceful, waiting to be needed, to be purchased, to move from his shelves into someone's home where it would be used and useful, serving whatever purpose it was meant to serve. Through the window, he could see a few townspeople going about their business. Mrs. Anderson walked past with her shopping basket. 2 men stood talking outside the post office across the street, their conversation apparently unhurried, both of them gesturing occasionally, though not in any animated way, just the normal movements people make when they are discussing something of mild interest. A dog trotted down the middle of the street, pausing to sniff at a post, then continuing on its way, purposeful, in the manner of dogs who know where they are going. Eventually, Mr. Harrison rose from his stool and went to check his ledger, running his finger down the columns of figures, making sure his accounts were accurate, though he had already checked them yesterday and the day before, and they had been accurate then. But checking again was part of his routine, and the routine was what gave structure to his days, what made one day flow smoothly into the next, each one similar to the last, each one carrying out its purpose in the same quiet, steady way. He made a note that he had sold 3 pounds of sugar today, and half a pound of coffee, and various other items that he listed carefully in their proper columns. His handwriting neat and regular, practiced from years of keeping these same records in this same ledger, or in ledgers before this one that had been filled up and put away in the drawer beneath the counter, where they rested now, chronicles of all the small transactions that had taken place in this store over the years, all the everyday necessities that had been purchased and carried home and used up and purchased again, the endless, gentle cycle of domestic life in this small town. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows at a lower angle, now creating long rectangles of light on the floor that moved slowly as the sun moved, and Mr. Harrison watched these rectangles for a moment, noting how they illuminated different parts of the floor at different times, showing the grain of the wood clearly, highlighting small imperfections, not here, a slight gap between boards, their details that were always present but became more visible in this particular light, at this particular time of day. He decided to reorganize a shelf of canned goods that had become somewhat disordered throughout the day as customers had looked at items and returned them not quite to their original positions. He took each can and checked the label, then placed it back on the shelf in proper order, grouping like items, together canned tomatoes with canned tomatoes, canned peaches with canned peaches, condensed milk with condensed milk, creating neat rows that pleased his sense of order and made it easier for customers to find what they wanted. This task took some time because he did it carefully and thoroughly, and because there was no reason to rush, and when he finished, the shelf looked proper and organized, and he stepped back to admire his work briefly before moving on to the next small task, which was to refill the jar of stick candy that stood on the counter. A jar that children looked at longingly when they came into the store with their parents, and from which they sometimes were permitted to choose one piece if they had been good and if their parents were feeling generous. He took the large container of candy from the back room and carefully transferred pieces into the display jar, arranging them so the different colors showed pleasingly through the glass: red and white striped peppermint, yellow lemon, green spearmint, a few pieces of butterscotch each, one representing a small moment of sweetness for whoever might purchase it, a tiny bright spot in the ordinary flow of daily life. The day was drawing toward evening now, though it was still light outside, the way it stays light late on summer evenings, the sun taking its time to descend toward the horizon, the shadows growing longer and softer, the quality of the light changing from the bright clarity of afternoon to something more golden and gentle, something that suggested the peaceful coming of night still some hours away. A few more customers came in during this time. Mr. Phillips needed tobacco for his pipe. Mrs. Warren wanted to look at the catalogs to see if there might be something she wanted to order, a new dish set, or perhaps some curtains, and she spent a long time turning the pages slowly, studying the illustrations and reading the descriptions, while Mr. Harrison waited patiently, ready to help if she needed assistance, but content to let her browse at her own pace, because browsing was part of the pleasure of shopping, and there was no reason to hurry her. Eventually, Mrs. Warren decided she would think about it for a few days before ordering anything, and she thanked Mr. Harrison for his time and left the store, and he returned the catalog to its place on the counter, ready for the next person who might want to look through it and dream of the things they might one day purchase, the objects that might make their homes a little more comfortable or beautiful or convenient. As the evening approached, the flow of customers slowed and then stopped, and the street outside grew quieter, with fewer people walking past, fewer wagons rolling by, the town settling into that peaceful pause between the work of the day and the activities of evening, when people were at home preparing their suppers, when the light was softening toward dusk, when everything seemed to take on a quality of calm completion. Mr. Harrison began the slow process of closing the store for the night, which was similar to opening it, but in reverse, checking the stock one more time, making sure everything was in its place, covering items that needed to be covered, closing cabinet doors, making sure no lamp was still burning that should be extinguished, tidying the counter one final time, removing the day's receipts from the cash register, and making a note of the total in his ledger, counting the money and storing it in the small safe beneath the counter, putting away his ledger and his pencil, straightening the stool, giving the floor one last glance to see if anything needed to be swept up, though nothing did. He went to the front door and stepped outside for a moment to look up and down the street in the gentle evening light. Everything was quiet and peaceful. A few lights were beginning to show in windows here and there as people lit their lamps for the evening. The sky was starting to show the first subtle colors of sunset, very faint, just a hint of pink and orange along the horizon. So soft it was almost not there, just a suggestion of what would come as the sun sank lower. Mr. Harrison went back inside and locked the door behind him, turning the key in the lock with a small, satisfying click that marked the end of the business day. He pulled down the shade on the door window, shutting out the street and creating a sense of separation between the public space of the store and his private space upstairs, where he would now go to prepare and eat his simple supper and spend the quiet evening hours before bed. He walked through the store one more time, just to make sure everything was as it should be, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor, his eyes taking in the familiar shapes of his merchandise in the dimming light, and then he climbed the stairs to his living quarters, each step creaking slightly in its familiar way, and at the top he paused and looked back down into the store below, seeing it peaceful and orderly, ready for tomorrow, when the whole gentle cycle would begin again, just as it had today, just as it had yesterday, just as it would continue day after day, in this small town where the routines were steady and the changes came slowly and life moved forward in its own quiet, measured way, without hurry, without drama, just the simple continuation of ordinary days filled with ordinary tasks, each one completed in its turn, each one completed in its turn, each one part of the larger part of work, as to us of pew with to with a better of so. With and with is with so and so q and with you so with so you it to I co it to with a to a few would I have to you with I it you I but to you that you have to do to have so you have that both that with it I both if I want if you with to you opening and closing, light and dark. The endless, gentle rhythm of time passing in a place where nothing much happened, and where that was exactly as it should be, peaceful and calm and endlessly, soothingly the same.